Two fighters, Mark Hunt and Brock Lesnar. The UFC is an organization that puts on mixed martial arts events. And we're gonna call it MMA for short. Now, this fight took place on July 9th, 2016 in Paradise, Nevada. And their fight went, quote unquote, the distance, that is the full 5 rounds or the full possible 5 rounds of 5 minutes each. And Lesnar prevailed by decision. And essentially what that means is neither fighter knocked one another out, nor submitted the other, and nor was the referee recommended to stop the bout from the doctors. Now, mixed martial arts is governed by a set of rules, okay? So there are another sort of feature of this situation, of this lawsuit, is the fact that there are certain rules that the fighters agree to contractually to obey during these MMA fights. And these rules include all sorts of things. I'm not going to go through all of them, but just to give you a sort of sample, no weapons, okay? That's one rule. And when you think of weapons, maybe you think of, I don't know, some sort of a firearm or a knife or something like that. But I think that it's reasonable also to include under weapons something like if a fighter was wearing packed gloves. Where packed gloves are, for example, one way to sort of pack gloves is to soak them in some sort of a material that will harden, some kind of plaster material, for example, that will harden and make the fighter's fists essentially more powerful and do more damage. There are other rules that govern the permitted moves, so no pile drivers. There's other rules that we could talk about their justification, but I'll just sort of lay a couple out. No spitting. Another rule would be no racial abuse. So there's a list of things that are prohibited in mixed martial arts, and we should say that one of the things that's prohibited is performance-enhancing drug use. Okay, and just as a kind of example of the kind of consequences that one could incur as a UFC fighter who does take PEDs, and as we'll discover, Lesnar did, then you can, a fight that you won can be overturned, for example, and turned into a no contest or something like that. So that might be one consequence. There are other consequences we'll talk about in Lesnar's case because he did suffer some sort of internal sanctions by the UFC. He didn't go unpunished. Let's just quickly say about some of the things that are permitted, just so we have an idea that there's a kind of negative side to the rules of what's not permitted, and then there's a positive side of what is permitted. So what is permitted includes strikes of many kinds, of most kinds. Okay, so for example, I'm not going to write this down, but strikes with the fist, with the elbow, with the feet, with the knees, with the shins, of various kinds of throws, and in addition, various kinds of submission holds and joint locks. And one interesting sort of project that you might do in your own time is explore the ways in which this set of rules in MMA, which are also observed in UFC, compare and contrast to other kinds of combat sports. Perhaps the most obvious, I think, that many people will already know about is boxing, where you're allowed to strike and strike only, essentially, or I guess you're allowed to do some grappling, but you're allowed to strike with the fist. You're not allowed to strike with any other part of your body except for your fist. And the amount of grappling is sort of, you can go into the clinch in boxing, so there is that. It's just that what you can do in the clinch is limited. So for example, you're not allowed to elbow in the clinch or something like that. You're not allowed to put someone in a kind of some sort of a rear naked choke or something like that in boxing either. And you can go through that with a lot of other combat sports. After Lesnar won via decision, he was found to have taken the performance-enhancing drugs of clomiphene and letrozole. Where clomiphene is an anti-estrogen and letrozole is an aromatase inhibitor. After having been discovered, having taken clomiphene and letrozole, Lesnar was fined and suspended from the UFC, and since then he hasn't fought in the UFC again. Now, the fight was overturned and declared a no contest, and then after that, Hunt sued Brock Lesnar and the UFC, or Zuffa, and Dana White for a number of different things. Okay, today we're focusing on the battery claim. And as we'll see, the central issue in the battery claim has to do with how we define ordinary activity in a sport. And it's going to turn out that depending on how we define ordinary activity, we're going to at least be pulled in different directions. And so sort of the major conceptual, we might say philosophical task of this topic is to figure out how we define ordinary activity, what the limits of ordinary activity is or are, what those limits are, and how we might bring this conceptual analysis to bear on the case of Hunt v. Zuffa. At the heart of the Hunt case is the question of what counts as ordinary activity in a sport. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at Judge Dorsey's opinion, and we're going to look at how she employs this concept of ordinary activity in a sport. So what does Judge Dorsey say in her opinion? Well, it's a lengthy one. The section that's specifically about the battery claim is fairly short, and so we're just going to look at a quick passage, and I'm going to sort of make a discussion based around it. Here's what Judge Dorsey says. Lesnar's PED use exceeded the range of ordinary activity during an MMA bout. And what does that mean? Doping is an unfortunately common issue in MMA. When we look at what it amounts to call something common, and we look sort of through some of the cases that are relevant to Judge Dorsey's decision, what we sort of can conclude is that common essentially means something that happens frequently. So if something is common for the purposes of Judge Dorsey's decision and the relevant case law and so on, and with respect to the dismissal of the case, common is something that's frequent. And so we can roughly say, if we can make sense at least of the notion of frequent, which I think many of us have an intuitive sense of what frequent means, one could argue, then if something, in other words, if something is frequent, then it's ordinary, all right? So if something is frequent, then it's ordinary, or it's part of the ordinary activity. And if something is part of the ordinary activity, it cannot function as kind of justificatory grounds for battery, okay? So anything that's ordinary or part of ordinary activity in a sport cannot be grounds for a battery claim or a successful battery claim. Something is common if it's frequent. If it's frequent, then it's ordinary. And if it's part of the ordinary activity, then it cannot be grounds for battery because there is a kind of implicit or explicit, in the case of professional sports, consent. And the idea is, if we think about, for example, being hit by a pitch in baseball, being hit by a pitch in baseball happens frequently enough that it's, as it were, reasonable to expect that someone playing baseball who knows the rules of baseball will understand that if I'm playing a game of baseball and I get hit by a pitch, I can't sue the pitcher for battery. So that's our sort of basic structural framework for the definition of ordinary activity that's relevant for Judge Dorsey's dismissal with prejudice of Hunt and Hunt's claim. However, there are a number of problems. One problem with the frequency account is going to be, of course, How frequent? Okay, it doesn't seem enough to rely on intuition here. Why? Because people's intuitions might differ, okay? Maybe there's overlapping agreement on many different instances, but maybe there's not for a lot of real life cases. So it turns out that frequency, using this frequency definition, it turns out to be a question about how frequent something has to happen. And also, suppose we do give a number, is there any justification other than intuition, which could presumably differ but wildly between people? So if so, how determined? I mean, presumably, it's not only going to be an issue of having different frequencies for different sports, but of course, necessarily, different frequencies of different prohibited acts, right? And that's another issue that we're sort of kind of assuming in the background, that some things are going to count as ordinary activity, even if they are rule violations. In other words, rule violations, if sufficiently frequent, can then, as it were, erase the grounds for battery. Now, in the case of Hunt, we are talking about a rule violation, namely the PED use. All right, so one problem with frequency accounts is saying how frequent, and if so, how determined. One other problem, and there's more than just the ones we'll cover, but for the sake of getting to the other issues, we'll just mention this one other, and that is, in the specific case of the UFC, how frequent is PED use in the UFC? It's not clear. And one more thing that I'll just sort of mention in passing, it does look like there are cases where something is infrequent and yet at the same time does seem intuitively maybe to count as ordinary. Now, what might be an example of something that's infrequent but also arguably ordinary? Take crashes in Formula One. It's not clear. I think a lot of people would say that crashes in Formula One racing are in some sense ordinary, even if it turns out that they're relatively infrequent compared to, say, for example, pitches that hit batters or something like that. I'm not actually sure about that particular statistic, but just as an example of the kind of thing that I think many people, for example, if you gave a survey out to a few thousand people and who knew what Formula One was, that in Formula One racing, if you ask them, are crashes part of the ordinary activity of Formula One racing? I think a lot of people would say, sure, yeah, that's ordinary, even if it turns out that they're not all of that frequent. I mean, we can imagine a case, for example, in some nearby possible world where there are significantly less crashes than there are in our world in Formula One, and yet nevertheless, people still sort of conceive of them as part of the ordinary activity, despite the fact that they're not extremely frequent. One might also think of another example might be being hit by a golf ball while at a tournament, a golf tournament. In some sense, I think many people would say that that's a part of the ordinary activity of tournament golf, and yet nevertheless, it might turn out to be fairly infrequent. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to read the full definition given in Knight, and then after I read it, I'll try to do my best to pick apart what I take to be two different kind of distinct features of the Knight definition. In the heat of an active sporting event like baseball or football, a participant's normal energetic conduct often includes accidentally careless behavior. The courts have concluded that vigorous participation in such sporting events likely would be chilled if legal liability were to be imposed on a participant on the basis of his or her ordinary careless conduct. The cases have recognized that in such a sport, even when a participant's conduct violates a rule of the game and may subject the violator to internal sanctions prescribed by the sport itself, imposition of legal liability for such conduct might well alter fundamentally the nature of the sport by deterring participants from vigorously engaging in activity that falls close to, but on the permissible side of, a prescribed rule. what I like to do then is distinguish between two features of that passage from Knight. We can distinguish between criteria for ordinary activity and what we might call justification for that criteria. Now, what are the criteria? Well, the criteria are that, one, the behavior in question, in order to sort of count as something immune from accusations of liability and therefore any damages in some sort of civil procedure, that it must be during an active contest. Now, we'll talk about what we mean by active contest in a moment. And in addition, it also has to be, in some sense, continuous with a permitted act. All right, now, before talking specifically about what we mean by particularly during an active contest, although maybe it might be obvious to some of you, let's distinguish between the criteria and the justification. And the justification for this criteria, the Knight Court says, is something like, we don't want to chill participation. Now, I'm going to say right now, I don't really think that justification is either necessary or helpful in any real way, and we'll talk about why. They don't want to chill participation. And there's reasons in general why we might want to reject and discard this, and also that have to do with the particular cases of MMA and professional sports and Hunt v. Zuffa. All right, during an active contest, the thought is, at least in the case of MMA, so if we just sort of look at the question of an active contest in MMA, what we're gonna find is something like this, that Lesnar's PED use was not during an active contest, or what we might just say in MMA, a fight. It wasn't during the occurrence of a fight. Okay, so clearly Lesnar's PED use does not count as being during an active contest, and so according to this Knight criteria would not be acceptable in some sense, would not be an acceptable kind of explanation for why Lesnar doesn't have liability for his actions during the bout. But I think it's worth saying a little bit more about both the general, more sort of general issues involved in getting a clear understanding of during an active contest. Another example that's actually discussed a little bit in the case law has to do with a batter in batters in baseball games. And so in that case, it looks like during an active contest would mean that a pitcher is not immune from liability if they hit a batter while the batter is in the warm-up area or in the on-deck area. Okay, why? Because when the batter is warming up in that area, that doesn't count as during an active contest. They actually have to be at the plate. So and a similar kind of consideration might apply to, say, tennis or something like that, right? So a player sitting on the side, getting ready to get on the court, that doesn't count as during an active contest. In other words, it's not sufficient merely to not, for example, be present in some sort of arena. That's not good enough to count as being part of an active contest. And even in MMA, what looks like a clear example of someone being in an arena but not being during an active contest would be between rounds, for example, right? A fighter is not allowed to attack another fighter between rounds either. So during an active contest, I think now we have some sense of that. Continuous with a permitted act, okay? And the thought there is that, again, just kind of going back to the MMA case, it doesn't look like Lesnar's PED use was continuous with a permitted act. What sort of permitted act would his PED use be continuous with? One fails to imagine because it doesn't seem like there is one. Now, what would count as continuous with a permitted act in the case of MMA? Well, perhaps I think arguably one could say we could imagine a case where one fighter is attempting, for example, a leg kick at another fighter. The other fighter moves their leg out of the way, and then the first fighter who is attempting the kick hits the second fighter in the groin. Okay, so groin strikes are prohibited, but that case where the groin strike is continuous with a permitted act, that would be a case that would provide the fighter, the relevant fighter, from some sort of immunity from liability because of the continuity of that strike with permitted strikes. If you want a case of a particular kind of maneuver that is not continuous with a permitted act, we might think of something like the pile driver maneuver, which is so difficult to do that it's hard to see how someone could be performing a legal move that somehow magically ended up as a pile driver. And the same would hold for something like small joint manipulation, where it looks like in order to perform small joint manipulation, there has to be some developed sequence such that it's not going to be continuous with a permitted act.